Heart forced Strat instant flash of her old caution at this, thinking, oh, how practical he must have made love to hundreds of women. And then his hands were no longer disembodied, and she was glad for the experience they had, as if it had all been waiting for her. The one fear hit her then, of pregnancy and disgrace, and she hated her own passion-thickened, fearful little girl's voice which had to ask that damned question that hurtled her out of the clouds. Do you have something? Don't you? I didn't know. All right. For the moment that he was gone from her, she closed her eyes, shaken with dizziness, and then he returned and took her into his arm. She felt the coolness of his skin and the warmth of the firelight, as if it were all in a dream filled with pleasure that was like pain and the old words of demand and obscenity that seemed like words of love via his mouth. He spoke them to her, and she spoke them back to him. Both of them urgenti, both of them with their eyes open, searching each other's faces, trembling, until the last moment when passion separated them. He did not draw away when he was finished, or let her go, but kept his arms around her, looking again into her face. The music on the phonograph had long since played out, and the room was silent except for the clicking of the needle against the last groove, forgotten and alone. She held him in her arms as if he were the child this time, and she a woman, and stroked his hair, wishing they could stay that way forever. Finally, he drew away. This damn thing, he said, amused and annoyed. I haven't used one of these things since I was 16 years old. You're speaking of the 16th of an inch between me and the home for unwed mothers. Well, next time you contribute. Well, what did you expect? Do you think I go to every cocktail party prepared for something like this? Are we having our first fight? From the shadows behind them, the telephone rang, softly. She looked at her watch. My gosh, shall they call it 2 o'clock in the morning? He stood up. Drink your brandy, he said affectionately, ruffling her hair, and went to answer the phone. Left by herself, she smiled into the fire, feeling the hot bitterness of the brandy in her throat and the faint scratchiness of the couch fabric against her bare legs. She could hear David laughing at something the person on the telephone was saying, and his occasional exclamations of amusement. She finished her brandy and stood up languidly, groggy with the aftermath of love and the kind darkness of the heated room, and went to the phonograph. She hefted the needle and turned the record over, tuning it down very softly so it would not disturb David on the telephone. There was an overflowing ashtray on the windowsill, and she picked it up and took it to the kitchen to empty it. She could still hear his voice on the telephone, masculine and laughing and independent, and she remembered the way it had sounded speaking to her in the words of lovemaking. The sound of his voice then had been for her and her alone. She could not remember ever having felt so content. She wondered whether the window in his kitchen was uncurtained because he did not own a curtain, or because it was at the laundry. He probably didn't own one. A bachelor as busy as he wouldn't even know about those things. Wouldn't it surprise him if she made curtains for him? She could pick out some fabric tomorrow. Back in the living room, she watched the fire slowly dying and the brandy level going down in the bottle as David talked on and on to whomever it was on the other end of the telephone. She could tell it was a business call from the conversation, and she was not surprised because people in the theater had a way of staying up until all hours. Her wristwatch said 2:25. It gave her a land of glow to know that she was here with him, in intimacy, waiting for him in the shadows. All right, boy, he said. Goodbye. Thanks for calling. Everything's going to be all right? He replaced the receiver and returned to stand beside where Greg was sitting on the couch. She looked up at him. I think I love you, she said. He smiled at her tenderly and bent down to kiss her forehead. I do love you, she said. He took her into his arms again. Chapter 6, Barbara Lamont, leaving the Fabian awful seas at 5 o'clock, paused for a minute in the dark outside the revolving door, and let the shrill crowd of girls pour past her into the night, going to their buses and subways and trains. It was an evening late in February, and surprisingly the air was soft with false spring. The store windows around Rockefeller Plaza were very bright, and Barbara walked slowly past them, dallying, looking in, imagining that some rich man was going to give her any of their contents she might choose as a gift. Here it was February, and this afternoon she had been typing copy for the June issue of America's Woman, the bridal issue. All the brides in the photographs looked so young, so airy, You found yourself wondering what their HVs had been like and whom they were in love with and going to marry, forgetting that they were only models. The blonde one on the cover with daisies in her hair and a look in her eyes like a child on Christmas morning had just been separated from her husband and had upset the shooting schedule the week before the picture was taken because she was in bed recovering from the results of an abortion. Perhaps that look she wore on her face for the bridal cover was a facsimile of the one she had worn on her own wedding day, and even Tlio things had turned her she remembered when they were different. Like me, Barbara thought. She had awakened very slowly this morning, with a sense of something she didn't want to remember, and had burrowed underneath the covers like an animal in its cozy lair, until her crib-trapped daughter's screams forced her out of bed. Then she had remembered, and in the remembering had realized that it was not such a dreadful thing after all. Today would have been her wedding anniversary. 3 years, a record. Really, for someone as young as she was, most of the girls she knew at work hadn't ever been married, much less married 3 years. The married girls were the ones she didn't see often anymore, friends of her high school days. She and those old friends called each other on the phone now and then since her divorce, and sometimes the wives would say, "When you have a date, why don't you bring him over one evening?" And she would thank them and never do it. You couldn't take a boy to spend an evening with a young married couple. She had discovered it would frighten him away. He would feel the trap closing in, even though it was an imaginary one, and he would think she wanted to demonstrate to him the contentment of marriage. She fitted into the married couple conversation so well. She was so used to it that sometimes in the midst of a discussion of recipes or household problems, I know, men are terrible about holes in socks. She would look up and catch her date looking at her with an expression that could range anywhere from boredom to panic. She stopped at a bakery on 6th Avenue to buy some honey buns for her mother. On the spur of the moment, she bought some animal-shaped cookies for the baby. She would try to teach Hillary how to say rabbit when she ate the cookie. It would probably leave a more lasting impression on her than a picture of a rabbit in a book. She had been thinking for a while now of changing the baby's name, perhaps to a nickname that the baby could eventually use as her Christian name when she went to school. Barbara had named her Hillary after her husband's mother, who was dead, and at the time it had seemed a gesture of love. She had never seen his mother, and now she almost never saw him. And the name Hillary had turned into an encumbrance that she wasn't particularly fond of, reminding her of people and a time that had lost their meaning. She was only glad that the baby hadn't been a boy because she would have named him after his father. And that would have turned into a nuisance. It was funny, she was thinking, how something that had seemed sentimental and important, and even more, almost sacred, could turn into nothing at all. If it had ever occurred to her in the beginning that all her love for this one man and everything they had together that was meaningful was going to disappear and be forgotten, the thought would have broken her heart. Today she was grateful for the flexibility that had allowed her to forget. Mac had been her first date in high school. Her first real date. That is, aside from her classmates who invited her to party. She was 16 and he was 20. She was a little thrilled at his old age. But when they had spent one evening together, she felt as if she had known him forever. It was love, like in the jukebox songs and the magazine stories and the pajama party gab fests. With birds twittering and pink clouds and no sense at all. She wasn't a very pretty girl. Her features were ordinary, but she was appealing looking. And when she was in love, she felt as if there must be something special about her looks to have won her such a prize as Mac. He was the best looking boy she had ever seen. And the difference in their ages made her give him credit for more intelligence than he really had. He had just returned from the army in Germany, and next to her classmates, he seemed an experienced world traveler. On their third date, he proposed, and although they kept it a secret from their parents, they considered themselves engaged from that night on. Being engaged, especially secretly engaged, was a strange, exciting state with little touch on reality. Barbara went about her daily routine, study, gym class, homework, sodas with the girls, university, where he was finishing college on the GI Bill. She kept house for him there, or kept their room, rather, because it was a dingy little one-room apartment with a convertible sofa and a rickety bridge table that almost always had books and papers and the remains of the previous meal. On it, they had only one closet, and the clothes popped out like a jack-in-the-box every time someone opened the door. She was taking courses at a nearby women's college and trying to keep up with her schoolwork and keep a home together all at the same time. When she began to be nauseated in the mornings, and often in the afternoons as well, she thought it was because she was still such an inexperienced cook. Mac himself had heartburn most of the time those first 3 months. Then she discovered that her problem wasn't indigestion at all, but something she should have suspected right away. At first, she couldn't believe it. It was not that there was anything organically wrong with her, but she simply couldn't believe that she, Barbara Lamont, was capable of doing something as complicated and adult as conceiving a baby. She was going to produce another human being, someone who would eventually go to college and fall in love and get married just as she had done. It was unbelievable. She, who had never even owned a dog, was going to be responsible for a human being for at least the next 15 years. Her disbelief turned to belief and then to fright. She began to look fat and ungainly. She was a plain girl, but her charm was in her neatness and warmth and in a kind of piquancy. How could anyone who looked like a fat spider look piquant? She was ashamed to go to classes, feeling somehow that a girl of 18 ought to look like those other sweatered and skirted freshmen, and not like a bloated, heavy-footed matron. The required reading for her courses, which she did faithfully, seemed both an escape and a reminder. She would be lost in the world of a novel by Thomas Mann and then look up at the sound of a group of college boys and girls laughing and tramping past her window. The apartment was on the first floor, across the street from the campus of Mac's college. The voices outside her window were discussing the class they had just attended, in heated argument that bore just the faintest undercurrent of flirtation and courtship. "Let's have a cup of coffee," she would hear one of the boys say. "Do you have time?" And a girl's voice would answer, "That would be wonderful." Her mood-broken Barbara would look around the room and notice the dust under the sofa bed. The dishes still to be washed, Mac's clothes tossed on the floor to be sent to the laundry or put away. She would get up, heavily and feeling sickish again, and put away her book. As soon as she finished cleaning the apartment, she would have to mess it up again preparing dinner. It was funny how a one-room apartment looks so dirty if you displaced one or two little things in it. It would be dark outside her window then, and waiting for Mac to come home, she would realize that she missed him terribly, because he was all she had. Neither of them quite knew what was happening to them, and to their marriage, or how to prevent it. Mac believed in live and let HE, and although it must have occurred to him many times to try to find out why Barbara was melancholy, he never asked. On weekends he took her to beer parties at the rooms of his college friends, and sometimes during the week he would take her to the campus beer house where the students raced up and down the aisles greeting their friends and crowded six at a time into narrow booths meant for four. The smell of the spilled beer and the half-put-out cigarettes made her feel ill. The girls who were out on dates with Mac's friends all looked so slim and carefree they made her feel twice as self-conscious as before. If she could have had one good thing, a ride in the country on a fresh day, a cleaning woman to clean up their tiny room once and for all, a new dress that was becoming, a close girlfriend to confide in, everything would have been all right. Neither her mother nor Mac's father had enough money to send anything more than rent, and even that was not easy for them. Barbara had been putting off writing her mother about the baby. After a while, when Barbara said she didn't feel like going to the beer house, Mac started going there alone. It was seldom enough that he had a chance to get out. What with studying and then the part-time job he had found as a busboy in Tly College cafeteria during the summer school. The job was to save money for the hospital bills and the expenses that would come afterward. They needed a larger apartment. As for Barbara, she didn't feel any more as if she were carrying a baby. She felt as if it were a tremendous growth, a tumor. And she wanted nothing so much as to go to the hospital at the end of the 9 months and have it leave her body. Even lovemaking was no longer fun, or even an escape. You had to care about your own body to want to give it to someone you loved. And when you felt that you were an ugly stranger, how could the giving of such a body be anything but embarrassing? Then Barbara went to the hospital to have the baby, and overnight, everything changed. One night she was in pain, screaming and wishing she were home with her mother again. And in the morning she felt for the first time that she was an adult. The first thing she saw when she awoke was her own flat stomach, her sense of identity restored. She was Barbara, of course. How could she have forgotten? The next thing she saw was her baby's round fuzzy head and its tiny body, so delicate to the touch, a sack of soft white clothing with litty limbs wrapped inside. She hadn't had the faintest idea how much she would love her baby until she touched her with her own hands. This was worth it. This was worth everything. How could she have been so childish, so ignorant, not to have realized how much love she had stored up in her own heart? Love came pouring out like an aura in the room, bringing tears to her eyes. She loved the baby. She loved Mac. How much she loved him. She had been ignoring him all these months. Poor Angel. And he hadn't complained or argued with her, ever. She would make it all up to him. She would make him happy. They would have a real home. She came back from the hospital into a 2-room apartment Mac had found Barbara worked as hard as she had ever worked in her life. Thoughts of further education forgotten. She cleaned the house and made the baby's formula and took all Mac's clothes to the cleaners. She polished her nails and went on a diet and read the women's magazines to find new recipes that didn't cost much that Mac might like. At Christmas, they went home for the first time, bringing Hillary. They stayed with Mac's father, and Barbara and Mac and the baby slept in Mac's old room among the framed pictures of his high school graduating class, his track medals, and his old forgotten albums of stamps. Perhaps it was the strangeness of the three of them brought together in this room that was so filled with memories of the past. Or perhaps Barbara had changed her attitude too late. Or perhaps it was simply that their life and their responsibilities were too much for Tlam to understand, and love was too fragile to make up the difference. "Look," Barb Mac said, running his tongue along his lower lip, snapping the blade of his jackknife in and out of its holder. He had found the old knife in his night table drawer the day before. "Look, Barb, I don't know how to say it." "Say what?" "Angel." "Don't call me Angel. It makes me feel worse." "Why?" He stood up and began to pace the room, angrily, putting his feet down with every step as if he were trying to destroy something painful that had been written on sand. "I'm not going back to Ohio." "Well, all right, darling. I don't care. We can leave Hillary with my mother and go back there to get all our clothes and the wedding presents. Most of the rest is junk, so we can sell it to somebody." "I don't mean that." "Well, what then?" He was flicking the knife blade against his thumb and it frightened her. She was afraid he might cut himself. His mouth twitched a little and he took a deep breath. "I mean, I'm not." He hesitated and then plunged on, enunciating very clearly. "I don't want to go back to Ohio, and I don't want to stay here with you either. I don't think you and I should see each other for a while." "What?" "But we're married." "I don't want to be married." Suddenly he was shouting, his face contorted with fear and guilt. "I don't want to be married, or we should never have gotten married in the first place." I'm sorry. They both stared at each other in silence, realizing at last that the words had been said, and that they had been true for a long, long time before they had ever been spoken. "I'm sorry," he said again, softly. "Please, don't leave me," Barbara said. "I'm doing you a favor." She hadn't meant to cry, but she was crying hysterically, the tears rolling down her face, her hands stiffly at her sides, not uplifted to hide her emotion. "Don't leave me," she wept. "Don't leave me. I love you." And all the time she was sobbing and crying out to him. At the back of her mind, she knew she would be relieved when he was gone. "Oh, baby." He put his arms around her. He patted her hair. "I love you," she said again. "Oh, God. It's just that we both hate Ohio and that apartment," she said, the words coming out calmer now. "We'll come back to New York. You can find a good job. We'll have money. You can finish your credits at NYU. Don't you understand?" he said. "No, I don't. We're married. We have a child, even if you don't love me anymore." He was standing with his back to her now, counting out money and putting it on the table. His voice when he spoke was emotionless. "I do love you, Barb. I don't know what's wrong with me. Maybe I should see a psychiatrist. Maybe I should never have married anyone in the first place. Maybe you shouldn't have. Or maybe we should never have married each other." He walked past her quickly, avoiding her hand that she stretched out to touch him. "I'll send you money," he said, and was gone. The next day, Barbara and Hillary moved downtown to her mother's house. She didn't know where to reach Mac, and the waiting was a nightmare for 2 weeks or so. Then it broke, like a fever. She felt strangely relieved and began to wonder what would happen to her now. The next time she saw him was with the lawyer when they got the divorce, and Mac could hardly look at her. Once he looked up, as if you were seeing her for the first time, and said, "You look beautiful. I never saw that dress." "Thank you," she said Polly, as if those were the last words they spoke to each other as husband and wife. She was remembering them now, as she often did, as she walked down the last street toward the apartment she shared with her mother and the baby. Yes, she was thinking, I should change the baby's name. Perhaps Barbara would be nice. Or I could even name her after my own mother. Who am I kidding? She thought, and unexpectedly her throat closed with pain. I'll never change the baby's name, or anything about her. She's the only thing I have left of him. It's too late. All the time I was thinking of myself and feeling confused and weighted down. It never occurred to me that Mac might be feeling the same way. Neither of us understood ourselves or the other person. How could we ever have gotten married? It's like holding hands and jumping off the top of a building. Did we think it was going to be any easier because we were holding hands? And now it's too late. Neither of them had remarried yet, but neither wanted to see the other again. They met once a month when Mac came to see Hillary. They would talk about the baby until they could think of nothing else to say about her. And then they would make small talk, and then he would leave. Whenever he had just left, Barbara would miss him. And yet she knew it was not Mac himself that she felt the loss of. It was something else, something intangible, a different life, a happiness they had had only for such a short time, a second chance neither of them wanted to take. A childhood that had turned abruptly into womanhood without the time in between. A time in between that had been restored to her now that she was too changed and serious. As she walked up the stairs to her apartment, Barbara began to feel trapped. She called her apartment the House of Women because it so conspicuously lacked a man's touch anywhere. Her mother, a widow. Herself, divorced Hillary, well, it would be a little girl just to round out the sewing circle. And as for Tly neighbors, well, there were the two middle-aged men who lived together in a 1.5 down Tly hall and looked more like nice old ladies than men. In fact, one of her dates had said once that they probably live in the 1.5 because it made it easier for them to chase each other. And Tlier was the strange, studious young man who lived next door with his crippled mother. Once Barbara had been alone with him in the elevator and he had stared at her with such animosity that it frightened her. And then there was April Morrison. At least April was normal, and what a relief it was to hear her reassuring Colorado twang and her amusing little faux pas that threw her into confusion when she realized what she had said or done. And as for herself, she was on her way to another evening in front of the television set, waiting for it to be late enough to go to bed. And she had thought marriage was boring. The blare of the television set greeted her through the thin front door of her apartment. Barbara let herself in with her key and put her packages on the dinette table. Her mother was sitting in front of the television set in an armchair, dressed in a long quilted bathrobe. She watched television all day long, often not leaving the house at all, and seldom bought Lear to dress. "Hi, Mom, look at this. This is a good movie," her mother said by way of greeting, Lifeboat. "We missed it when it was playing around the neighborhood. I brought honey buns," Barbara said. "That's my sweet girl. We can have them for dessert." "What's for dinner?" "Oh," her Mottlier said. "I didn't go to the store today. I didn't feel so well." "What's the matter?" "I don't know. I had pains in my stomach. It was nothing." "Did you call the doctor?" "It wasn't anything." "What did you do all day?" Barbara asked, already knowing the answer. Her mother shrugged. "What do I always do?" "You sat in that chair and watched television. When I left for the Awful-Sea this morning, you were glued to the Breakfast Club. Then you saw all your soap operas and the afternoon quiz show and the Twilight movie. You probably even watched Kukla, Fran and Ollie and Lucky Pup and any other kiddie shows they're offering today. And you complain you have pains in your stomach. Do you want to know why you have pains in your stomach?" "Why?" "Sitting down all day. That's why. Why didn't you go out for a walk or something?" "Walk? Where should I walk?" "Call up one of your friends. Mrs. Oliphant was here today for a while. She watched TV with me. Then she took Tly baby out for a walk. She's crazy about Hillary. I'll go see her." Barbara went into the bedroom that used to be hers before she was married, and which she now shared with her child. A crib, another dresser, a bassinet, and an assortment of stuffed animals, blocks, and dolls. Hillary was in her crib, wearing her blue sleeper. She stood up at the sight of her mother and tried to climb over the bars. Barbara lifted her out and addressed her. "Hello, sweetie. How's my baby? How's my angel?" She leaned down to hold Hillary's hand, and they walked together into the HVing room. Her mother was avidly watching a commercial. Barbara continued into the kitchen and swung the baby up onto the drain board, talking to her. "Now you watch me while I fix dinner. All right? And I'll tell you what I did today. We were working on the bride's issue today, for June, you remember. Oh, it was funny. They had to take pictures of the models on the roof in filmy white nightgowns and peignoirs. Against the skyline, very romantic, and the photographer had to use a filter so you wouldn't see the goose flesh. The baby sat solemnly on the edge of the drain board, her fat legs sticking straight out, chewing on a piece of bread and lulled by her mother's pleasant voice. Well, I guess we'll have to have canned ravioli again tonight. There's nothing else since Nana didn't go to the store. You like ravioli, don't you, Angel? You know, I think I'm going to get another raise in June. I put in for one. My boss said I'm the only girl in the Beautifull BCE who has the nerve to ask for a summer raise a month after she got her New Year's one. But she was smeeing when she said it, so I know she thinks the one I got last month was too small. It was a joke. You know that. $5 a month. Did you ever figure out what that is a week? The baby, comforted by the security of the voice she knew so well and the words she did not understand, curled up on the drain board and fell asleep, her thumb in her mouth. Her piece of bread, damp and chewed, fell to the floor. Barbara looked at her and shrugged, smiling lovingly. She picked up the child in her arms and carried her to the crib. In the living room, her mother, wreathed in cigarette smoke, was still watching television. Barbara went back to the kitchen and began to open cans, listening to the muted sounds of voices from the other room, voices that couldn't answer, speaking to a woman who had for some reason given up caring whether she had anyone to speak to or not. Barbara heard the sound of the kitchen clock ticking, the click of a spoon on the edge of a pot. She heard a voice inside her head speaking and knew it was her own voice speaking to herself. "Talk to me?" it said. "Talk to me." "I'd love to," she said aloud. "Nobody in this house ever talks to me," the voice said. "I know," Barbara answered. "Me neither. I bet Mother had a fine talk with Mrs. Oliphant this afternoon," the voice said. Mrs. Oliphant probably said, "It's a shame Barbara hasn't remarried. Such a nice girl." "Oh," Mother answered. "It's not for lack of being asked. She just isn't interested right now. She'll choose when she's in the mood for it." "Oh, I'm sure," Mrs. Oliphant said. "I'm sure?" "Dozens of suitors," Barbara said, "all of them proposing. In a pig's eye, they are." And then Mrs. Oliphant went away and met one of her friends. The voice went on. And the friend said, "How's Barbara?" And Mrs. Oliphant said, "I don't think she's so happy. I'll bet she's sorry now that she tossed away that nice Mac Lemon. I'll bet she'd like to have him back. I can just hear her," Barbara said. "And would you?" asked the voice. "Would you like to have him back?" "Stop bothering me," Barbara said. "Would you?" "No, I just want someone to talk to. Someone to talk to me. Someone to care about. And I'll find him. So you butt out and you shut up. I'll find him. You'll see. It'll be sooner than you think. To borrow your own gentle phrasing," the voice said. "In a pig's eye you will." Chapter 7. In June, there was an early heat spell, with waves of hot air rising from the sticky pavements and restaurant patrons complaining loudly. "Hey, where are you going to get that air conditioning on?" In the mechanically cooled, wide-windowed cubicles of Fabian Publications, life went on as usual. Mike, Rice, and Caroline had fallen into the habit of meeting at 5 o'clock by the water cooler, nodding at each other, separating and meeting later in a small bar on 3rd Avenue. It was hard to keep anything private at the Beautifull BCE. Everyone in the place knew that Miss Farrow was having an affair with one of the vice presidents. Everyone except Mary Agnes, who knew it but refused to believe it. Even though Mary Agnes managed to be first with the most in the gossip department, she could never bring herself to believe that people were actually doing it. She would grin, look shocked, and whisper, but at the back of her mind was always a reservation, probably because the sexual actions of the others were so removed from anything she herself would ever contemplate. Brenda had gotten married, and a week before the wedding there had been an Beautifull BCE party, with all the girls chipping in $1 apiece for the gift and getting slightly tipsy on one whiskey sour downstairs in the bar. After the honeymoon, Brenda had brought a huge white leather photograph album to the office, titled Our Wedding, and had insisted that every girl in the bullpen look at it and give appropriate compliments. I was right, Caroline couldn't help thinking, he is a moose face. Through Mr. Shalimar's intervention, Caroline had received a $10 a week raise and the title of reader, and she had moved in with Greg. She had the apartment to herself most of the time because Greg was out with David Wilder Savage, an arrangement which Caroline found quite convenient. Greg usually returned about 3 o'clock in the morning because David had one rule: no girl was ever allowed to spend the entire night in his apartment. What's the matter? Caroline asked Greg. Is he afraid for his maid? He just likes to be alone at times, Greg said. He's a lone wolf is right, Caroline Tlaya, but said nothing. She wasn't quite easy in her mind about this affair. Not that she was a prude, despite her stringent upbringing and the virtuous lies she and her college friends had all told one another about their private lives. But she felt with a certainty that David Wilder Savage did not love Greg, despite what Greg wanted to believe. In the first place, he had never said he loved her. Then, too, there was his reputation. Why should a man like him, who had everything he wanted except a heart, turn mushy over a girl like Greg? He never called for her or took her home, but made her meet him at his office or at a restaurant. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he took her down to the street in front of his apartment and put her into a cab. Was this devotion? But he called Greg every day, and he saw her nearly every night, so that at least was devotion of a sort. Some people are made to be hurt, Caroline told Mike one night. It doesn't even take much trying. Greg is that type, and look who she's tied up with. Don't you think she chose him for that purpose? Mike asked. To get hurt? Not Greg. Don't you think she would have avoided him? Not David Wilder Savage. I could hardly have avoided him myself. You met him. Twice Greg and I were having a drink in a restaurant before he came to meet her. He talks to you like you're the only person in the world. Would you like to sleep with him? Mike asked calmly and curiously. Mike, I don't think about men I meet that way. Why not? Well, girls don't. Of course they do, Mike said, finishing what was his 8th or 9th drink. Women have exactly the same feelings as men do, if they'd only admit it to themselves. A man sees a beautiful girl walking down the street, or he meets her somewhere, and he says to himself matter-of-factly, with no intention of doing anything about it, I'd like to sleep with that girl. That doesn't mean he'd even try to start a conversation, but he accepts his own feelings. Why do you drink so much? Caroline asked. Are you changing Cly's subject? Maybe he isn't such a different subject. I can't believe that anyone would drink as much as you do simply because he likes the taste. You're right, he said cheerfully. I sit here and watch you night after night. You drink and talk with no sign whatever that you're getting high. And then all of a sudden you get up and walk out as if you're going to fall on your face. I like whiskey, he said. I prefer it to people. Why? It's simple. No problems, no responsibilities, no reproaches. Take you and me, for instance. I woke up this morning, and as usual I was thinking about you. And all of a sudden I knew I was in love with you. He said it so matter-of-factly, with that same expressionless look on his face, that it took Caroline an instant to realize what he had just told her. She caught her breath. He was sitting there sipping his fresh drink, not expecting a reply, not asking her if she loved him in return, simply making a comment that could or could not be important to both of them. She was touched, and she realized how much she trusted him. He would take care of everything. Everything would be all right. What did you do then? She whispered. I got out of bed and found a towel, and then I went back to bed and thought about you some more. Oh, Mike, you're terrible. Terrible. What a way to talk. And yet, she was still touched, despite her embarrassment. I'd like to have an affair with you, he said. But I think if you had an affair with me, it would ruin your life. He had put down his drink now and was leaning across the table looking at her intently. He did not touch her. Let's have a strange affair. A private love affair all our own. A vicarious mental affair. What's that? I don't quite understand. We'll tell each other everything we're thinking. We'll be absolutely honest with each other. I'll tell you everything I want to do to you, and you tell me everything you want to do to me. We'll have a real affair of the heart. Do you understand now? But why? Caroline asked.
Because I have my mind in my bottle, and you have your youth and your future. That's no trade, Caroline. The harm is all to you and the gain is all to me. I think about you most of the time, Caroline said softly. I think about all the things I want to tell you. And I remember what you've said to me. I care very much about what happens to you. I warned you about that a long time ago, he said. Do you remember? Oh, yes. She laughed. That night with that terrible blind date? What was his name? Alvin Wiggs? He smiled. Whatever happened to him? He got married to a nice girl. They do, you know, slowly their hands moved across the table and met. He held her hand gently, caressing the tips of her fingers with his thumb. Don't marry a fool, he said. Don't get trapped by some nice boy your family parades out for you. You have brains, a future. Marry only someone you adore, someone you can't stay away from. But most of all, marry only someone you respect. If you marry a man you don't have enough respect for, it will kill you. She thought of Eddie then and her heart turned over, but she did not remove her hand from Mike's. His hand was comforting and she wanted him to stay near her. I knew someone like that once, she said. He's married now. I don't know if I'll ever find someone who affects me that same way. Wait for it, Mike said. There's no hurry. You have a long time. I wish I could have married you myself. You? Oh, 20 years ago, when I was your age. But you were just bomb then. What a marriage we could have had. And now I'm a different person. And there's a whole life between you and me. We keep making decisions every day, half without thinking, half against our will. If we don't fight back, if we allow ourselves to be changed, then once it's done, we have to do other things. And on until the person we wanted to be is so far away in the past that we only remember him, longingly, as if he were a beloved stranger. How dreadful, Caroline said. One don't want that ever to happen to me. He didn't say anything for a minute and then lifted her hand and kissed it very gently. I'm afraid for you, he said. You're too smart, too pretty, you want too much. You know, there's a wall in Italy covered with bits of feathers and blood because thousands and thousands of sparrows hurl themselves against it every year and are killed. Why do they do it? Who knows? You know who are the lucky ones. The Mary Agneses of this world. Mary Agnes has her whole life figured out. Get married next June, save her money, plod along in her job, never look to life to give her anything more. She's the poor little product of training and ignorance and habit, and she's smarter than any of you. I had plans like that once, Caroline said. Well, maybe we all get one chance to be a Mary Agnes. You lose it, and that's it. You're on the way. But you see, if you were a real Mary Agnes, you'd find a second chance, even if it wasn't as good as the first. That's just what you told me not to do, Caroline said. I'm drunk, said Mike. He stood up. Let's go. I'll take you home. He took her to her house and stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs outside. Think about our Eiffel fare, he said. All right. He looked at his wristwatch. It's 11 o'clock. I'll be home in my hotel and in bed by 11:30. I'll think about you then. Will you think about me? Yes, she said. Think about me from 11:30 to 12, he said. And tomorrow when I see you, you can tell me what you thought and what you did. What should I do? She asked curiously. Whatever you want to, he said very solemnly. And then he touched his lips in a little salute and walked quickly away into the darkness. Upstairs in her Uving room, Caroline put on her pajamas and drank a glass of milk. She kept her wristwatch on and looked at it every now and then as she sat on the edge of her studio couch bed. He must be home now, she thought, in that dismal hotel where Mary Agnes said he lived. Perhaps he was stopping for a last drink at the bar. She was not in the least sleepy and she thought she might wait up for Greg, read a magazine, listen to the radio, or take a bath. She was supposed to think about Mike, but what could she think? She was not accustomed to being told to think about someone at a specific time, and all of a sudden it seemed a difficult thing to do. It was easier to think about herself. Did she love him? No, not the way she had loved Eddie, or the way she had loved anyone in her life. He fascinated her, and she thought she might be happy if she could fall in love with him, despite his warning. She did not know any other men who understood what she was thinking. Mike seemed to be able to look deep into her heart and see not only what was puzzling her, but give her the answers as well. In her mind, she could hear his voice again as he said, "I knew I was in love with you." She said the words over and over to herself and found them both exciting and comforting. If she could love Mike, it would be the only exciting thing in her present life. She knew, and knowing it, she was half in love with him already. With any Atelier man, she would not have dared to think of falling in love, much less try to fall in love with him. But she felt utterly lulled and cared for. Mike was older, he was perceptive, he would never desert her as Eddie had done. He would never marry her either. But she was so young, only 20, and she had a long time yet before she had to think seriously of marriage to anyone. It was a relief to put it off, to think of emotions and new feelings without worrying about any permanent attachment. She never really thought of Mike in a physical sense. She could not even imagine him kissing her on the mouth. What she thought of was the challenge of him as a person, as a companion, as her dearest friend, and as a lover on a plane she was only beginning to know existed. She could not tell Greg or even April about any of this. They would never understand. And Caroline was not so sure that she herself really understood. It was midnight. She didn't want to wait up for Greg now. She wanted to go to sleep as quickly as possible so that she could keep all her thoughts to herself. The idea of having to talk about trivialities with anyone at this moment, even a close friend like Greg, seemed a heavy imposition. Caroline turned off the HG and curled up in her lumpy bed, and found herself dreaming of Mike, not quite sure if she were awake or really asleep. From then on, it became easier to fall into their game, or their affair, as he continued to call it. Soon the idea of calling his image to mind at a specified time did not seem bizarre at all. On any night when he forgot to tell her to think about him, Caroline felt somehow deserted. She would tell herself that he had merely forgotten, and then she would wonder why. She felt as though he had left her waiting for an appointment. As for Mike, she knew that he had a more pronounced physical reaction to these thoughts of her than she did to her thoughts of him. When he told her what he did about it, she was appalled. "Why?" he asked. "But that's so. That's for children. Little boys. Adolescents. Caroline, when will you learn that nothing two people do when they love each other is wrong? That's just it. It isn't two people. It's you by yourself. It's dreadful. It's so isolated. It isn't isolated because it brings me closer to you. How can it? When it embarrasses me even to think of your doing it. If we're having a love affair," he said, "you mustn't be embarrassed by anything. You'll have to accept your feelings and mine too. Sometimes I think it would be better if we really had an affair," she said. "Rely on me," he said ruefully. "It wouldn't. This way nothing can touch you, nothing can hurt you. That's all I'm concerned about, not hurting you." For the moment, Caroline could not protest. She could only be grateful. He never took her to his room, nor would he come to her apartment. They sat in bars, 3rd Avenue saloons with sawdust floors, the Fabian bar in the darkest corner, sometimes some of the cocktail lounges in Radio City. They often ran into people who worked at Fabian whom Mike knew. And after a while, Caroline realized that the Ophel BC gossip probably assumed that she and Mike were having an affair with each other. It was ironic, she thought, because they so obviously were not. And yet there was an intimacy growing between them that could never be called merely a friendship. "You know," she told him one night, "if it's possible to say that one mind is sleeping with another mind, then that's what we're doing." "Anything is possible," Mike said. "Tell me what you want me to do to you. You know I hate to talk that way. Tell me." "How else will I know? It embarrasses me. Do you want me to kiss you?" "Yes," she said. "Then say so. I want you to kiss me, and you never do, you know. Just good night, like an old uncle." He leaned across the table in the blue lighted dark and kissed her lightly on the corner of her lips. "There you go again." She couldn't help smiling. "If I started to kiss you, really kiss you, I couldn't stop there. You make me feel like such a child." "Come on," he said. "What do you want me to do to you? Kiss me." "You said that." She looked down at her hands, clasped on the tabletop, very white against the darkness of the cocktail lounge. It was dim light, meant to be seductive, and there was nostalgic, unrecognizable music playing somewhere nearby. Mike looked so much younger in this vague dimness. He looked almost 30, and what was so wrong about being 38? He was still in his 30s, And you couldn't say that someone in his 30s was so terribly old for a girl of 20. What else? You know, do you want me to touch you? Yes. Where? At times like this, Caroline was so annoyed at him she was sure that she did not love him, and yet she was powerless to stand up and walk away. His voice and his words held her captive because they were the words of love spoken in the tone of love. And they had come important to her because they came from him. Perhaps she did love him. Certainly she could think about no one else. And whenever she found herself out on a date with one of the boys she had met since her broken engagement, she found herself comparing him unfavorably with Mike. They all seemed so dull. They could not stir her as he did simply by touching her hand. Because now, at last, she was thinking of Mike in a physical way, and she wished that he would simply neck and pet with her, as Eddie had. Without all this solemn talk of affairs and ruining lives, you have to hold my hand while I'm telling you, she said. He reached out for her hand and grasped it very gently, and the tremor she felt from his touch reached all the way up her arm to her breast. You're ruining my vocabulary, she said, smiling. I'm beginning to shock people without realizing it. Who? That flighty roommate of yours? No, not Greg. My mother and father. I went home to Port Blair last weekend, and we were having a simple conversation at dinner. Or not so simple, really. Because everything my mother and I talk about lately has overtones. And I looked up and saw her face looking aghast. She's not quite sure what I'm doing here in New York. She keeps saying, I hope you're meeting nice boys. She says, I hope you're having lots of fun. All with a little rise and inflection at the end of the sentence because it's really a question, not a comment. And then I said something you told me. I can't even remember what it was. It was something that seemed so natural when you and I were speaking together. And my mother raised her eyebrows and drew in her breath and said, Caroline, where do you get those ideas? I suppose your mother wants you to get married as soon as possible, he said pleasantly. Then she thinks you'll be safe at last. Yes, but only to someone whom she would consider a good catch. My mother doesn't want me to marry just anyone for the sake of getting married. What about love? Oh, that too. But my mother thinks a sensible girl will fall in love with the right person. It's so easy, isn't it? He said, to tell someone else what is the right thing for him to do. There's no emotion involved and you see right and wrong clearly. Take Mary Agnes, Caroline said. Do you know how I see you? He asked. I see a little girl sitting on a rock in a glade near a forest. The Pied Piper comes along playing his music, and all the other little girls leave the security of their homes and dance along after him, far, far away to another land. That's the land of marriage and respectability, and who knows, maybe disappointment for some. All of them, or nearly all, follow the Pied Piper, but you don't. Then along comes Pan, grizzled and hairy, with a leer on his human face and the sweet music of the pipes of Pan in his mouth. He goes off into the forest, and a few 8-sheetal girls like your friend Greg follow him. They're the ones who have the courage to break with tradition, to live as freely as they like. You watch them disappear into the forest, but you don't follow Pan either. You want to think the way you like and age freely, but on the other hand you want to be married and conventional and have a family. So you just sit there on your rock and you say, what will become of me? What will Caroline ask? What will become of me? Do you think I'm a prophet? He asked with a little smile. Sometimes I nearly do. I think you'll be very successful, he said thoughtfully. I think you could love some man very much. I wish he could have been me. Maybe you will be you, Caroline said. Would that frighten you? Only for a minute? Then I'm afraid I'd be selfish enough to be delighted. Spontaneously, she leaned down in the darkness and kissed his hand, Caroline. I love you. I wish it were 1932. Then I wouldn't be here, she said, smiling. You see, we're lost. Why couldn't we love each other anyway? I know a WD now in Port Blair who married a man 20 years older than she is, and they're very happy together. And when she's 60 and he's 80, she'll be holding him up, getting into taxicabs and warming his glass of milk at night and telling him the same story over and over because he forgets it as soon as she tells it. Adel, Caroline said, the way you live, you'll never live to be 80. One hope not, he said cheerfully, and swallowed his drink and what was left of hers. You know, she said. I have changed. I can notice it in little reactions I have to things. A kind of acceptance of ideas that are different from mine, and of people who used to awe me. And all that in the 6 months we've been friends. 5 of those 6 months we would have been married to each other, he said, if we had been lucky. It was the first time he had actually spoken of marriage, and Caroline was started. He loved me long before I loved him, she thought in surprise. Longer than I ever suspected. She wondered what it might have been like to be married to Mike Rice. She could do things for him, make him drink less, give him a real home. Look, she thought to herself, here I am again, being the little girl on the rock, dreaming of domesticating this renegade. And yet, he appeals to me so because he knows so much of life. I can just see him in my HVing room at Port Blair, Sunday dinner with the in-laws. What are you laughing at? Mike asked. Myself, I guess, she admitted, for daydreaming. The last weekend in June, all the employees at Fabian, from the vice presidents down to the shipping clerks, were driven out to the country and chartered buses for the summer awful BCE party. It had been a tradition of old Clyde Fabian's to have the party at his golf club on the Hudson. And even though he was ill and incapacitated, he insisted that the tradition be continued. The party was held on a Friday, starting at 10 in the morning, the last work day of the week, so they all could have their hangovers on their own time the next day. There was softball, swimming, golf, a huge outdoor buffet lunch, liquor, dancing, and a return trip to the city at 6 o'clock in the evening. Caroline went with Greg, April, and Mary Agnes. You know, Mary Agnes said, at my girlfriend's office they have the nicest thing. They invite all the husbands and wives and children to the office party, so they can all be together. What? Said Greg. And cramp everyone's style. The girls laughed, except for Mary Agnes. I think it would be more fun, she protested. Last year when I was wearing my bathing suit, Mr. Shalimar kept making remarks about what nice legs I had, until I thought I would die of embarrassment. This year I almost didn't bring a bathing suit. Just think, April said. This is my first office party. All of ours, Caroline said. I'm dying to see a real Eastern Country Club, said April. Are the drinks free, or do we have to pay? Greg asked. Free, said Mary Agnes. And everybody gets so drunk it's terrible. I can't wait, said Greg. This party is my swan song. I'm going to take the 3 days vacation I have coming to me and then quit. Quiddle David is getting me a job in summer stock. I'll be the ingenue in at least 4 plays. Not only is it real, genuine United States money, but I'll only be in Connecticut, so I'll be able to see him. That's wonderful, Mary Agnes said. I never would have asked him for a favor, Greg said. But he suggested it. Isn't he a darling? Imagine David Wilder's savage opening doors for you that way, April breathed. You're so lucky. It's marvelous. There was not a trace of envy in her tone, but only awe and pleasure at Greg's good fortune. If there was any girl who was completely without jealousy or rancor, Caroline thought, it was April. As the bus drew up in the wide white gravel driveway of the club, there were varied ecstatic exclamations from the occupants. Caroline and Greg were sitting at the back of the bus, and so were the last to leave. Directly ahead of them, April and Mary Agnes hurried off to join the throng. Greg looked at Caroline. I don't know why we ever came, Greg said. I know. I hate a brawl. All these strangers, and Shelley Marwood doubtless want to act out one of the sex scenes from our latest manuscript. Do you think he can? Greg asked. I wish they'd just give us the money instead of spending it on a party, Caroline said. Me too. They walked slowly over to a long table, which was set under a group of leafy trees and foliage, and which was obviously the bar because it was clustered 4 deep with Fabian employees, like ants on a wedge of cheese. At the edge of the crowd, Caroline saw Mike standing with a glass in his hand, talking with 2 editors from other magazines whom she had never met. He looked so adult and businesslike that for a moment she had the odd thought that she did not know him at AU. 3 men, probably talking business or telling the kind of jokes they did not like women to listen to. She felt very young and self-conscious, and she took hold of Greg's arm. Maybe your friend has pulled, Greg said, nodding toward Mike. The only place I'll get a drink in this mob is down the front of my dress. I don't really want one. Of course you do, Greg said. How are you going to play touch football with the mailroom boys if you don't fortify yourself first? Caroline laughed, but her hands were cold. It was a hot summer day with a touch of breeze that brought the smell of freshly cut grass, perfume, cigarette smoke, and hickory smoke from the outdoor barbecue pit, which had just been lighted. The breeze made her shiver, and she didn't know why. She looked toward the periphery of the crowd of merrymakers and saw Mike looking at her, his face boldly solemn and a trifle amused, as if he had wandered into the wrong party. His gaze seemed to join him with her. She felt as if it were a bridge that she could climb across until she was safely by his side. She moved around the crowd, hardly feeling a heel dug into her instep and a fat arm grazing her breast, and moved breathlessly into his circle under the tree. He introduced her and Greg to the others. One of the men gave Greg the drink he was holding in his hand, and she beamed with delight. "Are you having fun, Mike?" asked Caroline. He took her arm and turned her deftly away from the group. "I'm so glad to see you. I don't know why I come to these things," he said. "It's harmless, I suppose. A little fresh air." He breathed deeply. "You like the country, don't you?" Caroline said. "I love it. I grew up on a farm. My heavens, one would never know. Why, is there a way to look if you come from a farm?" She shrugged. "That's just me being provincial again, I guess. You should have seen the farm," he said. "It was for boys from 4 to 14 who didn't have a home or were too old. My God, one time when I was 10 years old, I jumped out of the hayloft hoping I would break my neck and die. But unfortunately, all I did was sprain my ankle. It didn't even incapacitate me enough to get me out of the extra chores I had to do for being so careless. Why didn't you write to your family?" Caroline cried. "Kids are funny," he said. "My father was dead, and my mother had 4 younger kids at home to take care of. I was the oldest, so I was the one who got sent away to that nice, healthful farm in the country. I guess I felt that she didn't give a damn about me, or else she would have let me stay home." "I think that's terrible," Caroline said. They were walking away by themselves now, and had left the others far behind. Mike sat down cross-legged on the grass and pushed a little space in the earth for his whiskey glass. Caroline sat down beside him and tucked her skirt around her legs. "I guess it's ironic," he said, "that now I'm the editor of a religious magazine. The main thing I remember about my Sundays in church is that every morning before I would go there, I would have elaborate fantasies about running down the aisle in the middle of the service and pulling off my clothes to show the whole congregation the welts that bastard had put there the night before. In my fantasies, the minister was always saving me. He was being very fatherly and saying, 'This boy need never go back to the farm again.' But, of course, I never had the courage to do anything of the sort." "I think that's just terrible," Caroline said. "How did you ever get out?" "When I was 14, I was graduated," he said cheerfully. "I went to work as water boy on a newspaper, and that was it." Would you believe it? Some of the graduates actually stayed on the farm, working as dishwashers or field hands, bullying the younger kid. It's amazing how kids can be brutalized into a mold in which they give it right back to the weaker ones, and never tlank of escaping from the whole filthy mess. "I wish you hadn't told me," Caroline said softly. "I can just see you as a little boy and it makes me want to cry. I hate and despise people who are mean to children. So do I. I never slapped my little girl. I never even raised my voice to her. I didn't even want to. That was one of the things my wife and I used to battle about. She wanted to crack the baby a lick or two and I wouldn't let her. So now she has full custody and VM the unfit drunken father." There was no bitterness in his tone and no self-pity. Only that same perceptive matter-of-factness he had when he spoke of any of the things that were so important to himself, or to Caroline. The calmness in his voice moved Caroline more than any emotion could have. She was filled with feelings toward him: pity, love, tenderness, remorse. For the first time she felt the loneliness in this man and, even more, the softness. He had always been gentle, but he had been gentle and strong. The leader and instructor. Suddenly there was only one thing she wanted to say to him. "I'll get you a drink," he said. "Don't you want one? In any case, I do." He rose to his knees, starting to stand up, and Caroline was instantly on her knees in front of him, facing him with her hands touching his shoulders. Please sleep with me," she said. He covered her hands with his own and tenderly took them down from where they were holding his shoulders. "No, darling. I'm asking you, you're not asking me. To a virgin. Stay that way. I always wanted my first love affair to happen spontaneously," Caroline said. "If you're going to argue with me, then it won't be spontaneous and you'll ruin it. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. "If someone has to be the first," he said finally, "then at least it will be someone who loves you. Come on!" He took her hand and lifted her to her feet. They ran down the hill toward the clubhouse, holding hands, not speaking but looking at each other every now and then and smiling. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, and she could feel the blood pounding in her ears. "I'll call a cab from the clubhouse," he said. "I don't have a car. Do you?" "No." They skirted a group of softball players, and Caroline recognized Brenda in a too-tight white jersey and a baseball player's cap tilted over one eye. She was playing second base, and she looked very tough. The boy who devored Caroline's mail in the morning was up at bat. In the group that was gathered around to cheer Caroline saw Mary Agnes and April's friend Barbara Lamont. The happy cries and noises of the watchers and the players seemed very far away, like voices heard through a glass window. She felt completely out of it, a part of her own H-Teetle world and this thing that was about to happen to her. And for once she was glad to be separated from the people she knew and the things that mattered to them, things which at this moment did not seem to matter at all. Mike went to the telephone booth behind the bar in the clubhouse, and Caroline waited for him in the cool, darkened room. Chairs were pushed against the tables, and a clock ticked loudly. The club was almost deserted by its members today because of the onslaught of Fabian employees. In the gloom at the far end of the room, Caroline heard the murmur of voices and saw a tall shape dressed in white and a smaller shape behind it. She recognized April, with a young man Caroline had never seen before. It seemed very important that April not turn around and notice her. Caroline tapped on the glass of the telephone booth, and Mike opened the door. She squeezed into the booth beside him. He replaced the receiver. "He'll be here in 5 minutes," he said, and kissed her on the temple. "We'll go to your apartment. If you change your mind along the way, I'll take you to a bar." She put her arms around his neck and he kissed her, this time really, for the first time. He stroked her shoulder blades and back and kissed her again. She loved him for saying that to her, for giving her the last-minute power of choice. And because he had, she knew she would not change her mind. On their way back to New York in the taxi, neither of them spoke. They held hands and looked at each other, each in his own thoughts and finding no need for words. Now that she had decided, Caroline felt very close to him. She had a sense of unreality, and the countryside going past the taxi seemed a mass of green streaks. She was scarcely aware of the breeze blowing on her face from the open windows or of the bumps and jolts. When they reached her house, she stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs while Mike paid the cab driver. Her house looked different to her, perhaps because she had never been outside it on a weekday noon. The Chinese laundry was closed for a 2-week summer vacation, and it was very quiet without the steam and the noise. There were 2 women sitting on the bottom step with baby carriages drawn up in front of them. She glanced at them, and for an instant she felt a pang of unhappiness, for no reason she could mention. Then Mike walked quickly up behind her and took her arm and they climbed the stairs. The apartment was dark and cool, with the shades drawn against the sun. He did not grab for her or kiss her immediately, for which she was grateful, but instead looked around the apartment, which she had never seen before. Tease. "A nice apartment," he said. "Would you like a drink? Till make you one." He went to the little metal bar in the comer and poured whiskey into 2 glasses and carried them into the kitchen. She could hear him taking ice cubes out of the ice tray in the refrigerator. He came out of the kitchen and they sat together on the edge of one of the studio couches sipping at their drinks. "Is this one your bed?" he asked. "Yes." "I've tried to picture it many times. Now you know? H-Teetle, narrow single bed." He smiled. "It's just as I imagined it. I ought to change the sheets. I hadn't planned on this." "Don't! Do you think I'd mind the sheets you've slept in?" They finished their drinks and put the glasses on the floor beside the studio couch. She was suddenly taken with fright, a last-minute resistance to the giving of self, a desire for one moment of privacy and self-communication. "I'm going to the ladies' room," she murmured, standing. She went into the bathroom and shut the door but did not lock it, afraid that he would hear the sitchka at the lock and know that she was frightened. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and put her forehead against the cool white porcelain of the sink. Would he be disappointed when he saw her naked? Would he think she was flat-chested? Would he think she was too thin? Her hands and her thighs were trembling, and yet she had never felt less in her life like making love. She felt as though she had made a bargain. and there was no backing out. Not because he would not forgive her, but because she would not forgive herself. Oh, my God, she thought. I wish I had married Eddie. Why am I here instead of married to Eddie? It's unfair. And then she thought, you fool. You love Mike and you want him. Grow up. Part 4 compilate next part 5.